Hello and welcome back to the research project History. In this video we're going to be having a look at The Historian's Craft by Marc Bloch. Marc Bloch was a French historian of medieval history. He served on the front lines of the First World War, where he rose to the rank of captain. Following the First World War, together with Lucien Febvre, he founded the Annales Journal. This journal argued against simple narrative history and promoted interdisciplinary study and the use of structural analysis. With the outbreak of the Second World War, at the age of 53, he rejoined the army in 1939 and witnessed the fall of France in 1940. Having taken part in the Battle of Dunkirk, he spent a short period in Britain before returning to Vichy France. Despite being a Jew, he was allowed to return to his teaching work with permission from the Vichy government for 2 years, as one of the only few Jews working in the university system at the time. During this period, he produced an unfinished transcript on which this book is based. As the book is based on an unfinished transcript and other notes, it isn't as polished as other works, but is nonetheless a very interesting book. After the Vichy government was replaced by a Nazi administration, Bloch joined the French resistance, working as a translator and courier. Unfortunately, on the 8th of March 1944, he was captured and held and tortured by the Gestapo, until his execution by firing squad on the 16th of June 1944, 10 days after the Normandy landing. In the introduction, he asks the question, what is the use of history? And although this may seem like a naive question, it is important for us to consider. Western civilization, by and large, has always been attentive to its past. However, although attentive to the past, does the society learn from it? Is it useful in teaching us about how we should act? From his perspective, writing in France during the Nazi occupation, it seemed as though society and civilization had failed to sufficiently learn from history. At the other end of the value spectrum, history is at least capable of entertaining. But if we use history as an object of entertainment and fascination, the participation in history causes us to pause and reflect. This is true of many areas of science and learning, which begin out of curiosity and grow from there. However, is mere fascination and entertainment enough to justify the process and effort of studying history? From his perspective, in the middle of World War II, during an upheaval in politics and with a lot of scientific discovery going on, either history had to prove its legitimacy as an area of learning, or those using their minds in it would be better employed elsewhere. It appears to be that there is a human desire not just to know facts, but to understand the reasons for the facts. History will prove its utility, its usefulness, if it is able to build human understanding. Many accusations have been made against the study of history being a worthy system of knowledge. These accusations are based on a false understanding of history. This book will seek to explain the practices and methods of the historian, and then leave it to the judgment of the reader as to the value of it. For most of time, history has been about constructing narratives around key events, and in his day, a more analytical and structural way of studying history was in its relative infancy. At the time, all sciences were in a process of updating their methodology. History as a field of study would have to work to show itself more useful while working on its methodology. In this way, he suggests that there was a need to take pride in the process and not just the output. Narrative history, that is, the writing of the stories, looks for output, a good book. Analytical history, rather, is about the process, and he uses the analogy of a good farmer, who is just as satisfied with ploughing and sowing as he is with reaping. That all the steps along the way are just as important in helping to build to the final outcome. In Chapter 1, History men, and time, he divides it into 7 sections. In section 1, the choice of the historian, he notes first of all that the word history is an old one, and while some seek to shut it out of the scientific modern world, we should instead maintain a broad understanding of what history can mean, and see how it can be included in a scientific way of thinking. With a broader understanding of what history can be, the word history, meaning inquiry in Greek, really is useful in what we are trying to do as historians. Although the methods for studying history have changed since the term was first coined by the Greeks over 2,000 years ago, so the methods of modern science are different to those of Aristotle, and yet many are happy to call both science. And as a broad area of study, the historian, like the scientist, will need to select their tools carefully. In section 2, History and Men, he makes the point that some have claimed that history is just the science of the past. But this is somewhat of an absurdly broad claim, because all the events of history, the only real common trait that they have across all of them is that they've happened prior to now. And because of the broadness of the subject, the methods and ways of studying it are going to be vastly different. This, however, does not make history unscientific. He argues that it would be just as difficult to come up with a scientific equation for the understanding of the entire universe as it exists currently. As any event can be history, and the various phenomena that cause the events in history can be historical, so that even if the usual method of studying that phenomena is scientific, we can still categorise it as part of the study of history. For example, if a once deep gulf were silted up over time, the usual study of such events would be geologists. But if the events were caused by the building of a harbour and the silting up of the gulf caused the abandonment of that town, the study of that geological event can rightly be considered as history. Since about 1800, there had been a debate as to if history is a science or an art, and by the late 1800s, the conclusion was made that history should be an art, and consequently be concerned with the form it takes. But even if it is concerned with form, there is no less accuracy or beauty in the properly constructed words of the historian than there are in a precise equation of a mathematician. In section 3, Historical Time, he notes that history has also been called the science of men, to which he adds the addendum of men in time. Time is different to a historian than it is to a scientist. Science uses and treats time as an abstract measurement, whereas historical time is used to describe a discrete and concrete event, a specific time, place, and event. The study of history is not the study of abstract events, like you can get away with in physics and maths. Historical time is on a continuum, and the only constant is change. And the question that remains for the historian is how much of the preceding and succeeding periods of time does the historian need to know about to understand a specific period of study. In section 4, The Idol of Origins, he observes that there is a popular idea that historians want to study origins of places or ideas. The term origins is ambiguous. On one hand, it could mean beginning, or it could mean the first cause. In some fields, the study of origins may be applicable, especially where there is a key person or event which leaves a long trail of effects. However, simply understanding what the first event in a series was does not in itself sufficiently explain the cause of the latter event, although it may inform it. There is a danger in history of conflating ancestry with explanation. He uses the example of etymology, where tracing a word to its earliest usage is less useful in understanding its meaning than studying its current usage and context. To put it simply, A historical phenomenon can never be understood apart from its moment in time. And he quotes an old Arab proverb, "Men resemble their times more than they do their fathers." In section 5, the boundaries between past and present, he starts by asking the question that just because the past does not entirely explain the present, is it utterly useless for its interpretation? Previously, there was a unanimous thought that the understanding of the present could only be achieved through the study of the past. However, with the rate of technological progress that had accelerated through the 20th century, a greater gap had appeared between the generations. There was a view in his day that history was finished and had been replaced with politics, social sciences, economics and journalism. However, what were these if not tools for historical analysis? Just because the name had changed away from history does not mean that the study of history wasn't still relevant and worth taking part in. In section 6, Understanding the Present by the Past, he argues that the view that history is irrelevant presupposes that the world has changed so much in such a short time that nothing from the past can influence our understanding of the present. Any society that would be capable of change so quickly and so totally within a generation would be so unstructured and variable that the generations alive within it would be unintelligible to the other. In his mind, this is a mistaken view. For those who think that the world has changed so quickly, in such violent, sudden steps forward, that the past and the future cannot understand each other, he looks at the world around him of his lifetime, the first half of the 20th century, and observes that despite all the change, all the upheaval that had occurred, the past was still sufficiently understandable to the present. In section 7, Understanding the Past by the Present, he notes that just as the understanding of the past can assist in the understanding of the present, so an understanding of the present can assist with the understanding of the past. Because of this, historians should be interested and invigorated by the current world. To be uninterested in the current world would, in Bloch's view, make one an antiquarian rather than a true historian. He concludes the chapter this way, and I quote, "There is, then, just one science of men in time. It requires us to join the study of the dead and of the living. What shall we call it? I have already explained why the ancient name history seemed to me the best. It is the most comprehensive, the least exclusive, the most electric with stirring reminders of a more than age-old endeavour. In proposing to extend history right down to the present, contrary to certain prejudices which are not so old as history itself, I have no desire to expand the claims of my own profession. Life is too short, and science too vast, to permit even the greatest genius a total experience of humanity. Some men will always specialise in the present, as others do in the Stone Age or in Egyptology. We simply ask both to bear in mind that historical research will tolerate no autarky. Isolated, each will understand only by halves, even within his own field of study. For only true history, which can advance only through mutual aid, is universal history." In chapter 2, he goes on to historical observation, and starts in section 1 with the general characteristics of historical observation. He notes that the study of history is an indirect study. Historians are unable to experience the events they write about, and even where writers from the past have recorded events that they themselves have witnessed, in almost every case they will have included information received from others, once again making the record indirect. This does not mean that the historian is incapable of establishing facts, just that they are required to use reasoning and logic to arrive at a conclusion. This can be done, for example, with the discovery of Amazonite beads in in Chaldea, which indicate that there must have been some sort of trading relationship between and India or Lake Baikal in around 3000 BC. The skill of the historian, then, comes in an ability to derive understanding from the available evidence. The facts of the past are by their nature not going to change. However, our knowledge of the past can and will change. Unlike other areas of knowledge, the ability to create new knowledge about the past can only be done with data that already exists. If an event is left unrecorded, there is no way of recording it now. In section 2, he looks at evidence. There are different types of evidence that is carried through time to the present. These are both intentional and unintentional. When Herodotus wrote down his inquiries, he wanted them to be read by future generations. Conversely, when an individual unloaded their waste at the ancient local rubbish heap, it is highly unlikely that he had the understanding of future generations in mind. Because of these factors, the narrative sources, while providing a framework and chronology, are not regarded as being strong evidence, while the unintended is more trustworthy as evidence, as it does not suffer the same bias of interpretation of the events. Without the addition of these unintended sources, the modern historian is only able to study the history as the ancient author intended them to consider. In the same way, details and side points in the intentional narrative sources can often be of more use to the historian than the main thrust of the narrative argument. No matter its type, all evidence needs to be cross-examined to test the veracity of its claims. The nature of evidence can be almost anything, from the intended narratives to the things made, to objects being impacted by human life that went on around them. Because of the variety in source material, the historian needs to become skilled in understanding and interpreting them. Many of these skills are difficult to attain, but a good historian should have a grasp of the fundamental ones of their chosen field of inquiry. However, no matter how skilled the individual historian, the only way to build a fuller picture of the past is by using the skills and abilities of other historians and experts. In section 3, he looks at the transmission of evidence. One of the primary and most difficult tasks for the historian is to assemble the documents and sources to be used in the study process. For many areas of study, these sources have already been compiled by other historians and archivists. And as thankful as the historian should be for the careful work done by these compilers, it is worth analysing their process, as it is a critical part in the transmission of knowledge and a connecting point between the historian and the past. Often significant sources, though existing, are not available due to the self-interest of those who control the sources. For example, businesses or rich landowners. Because of this, it is often during war or other chaotic events that new historical sources are made available to the historian. Whatever the causes for the sources to have been transmitted to the time of the historian, they need to analyse them for tracks, snippets of information that tell the historian more than they seem to on the surface. In chapter 3, he looks at historical criticism, and in section 1 gives an outline of the history of the critical method. Not all witnesses of events give an accurate account of the event, and even if this is known in principle, it is often not thought about as much as it should be. On the other hand, blanket scepticism to any claim without reason can be equally misleading. Also, so-called common sense, frequently thought of as a midpoint between complete scepticism and the uncritical reception of any information, is also insufficient. Many of the events that occurred in history defy common sense. Rather, there is a need for a method for divining objective facts. It was during the 17th century that the method of critical reception of sources was developed. Despite these methods having been developed, many in the field of history stayed with the narrative retelling of sources. However, by the 19th century, there was a move towards historians getting their hands wet and doing the technical work of critical analysis. In this technical, critical method, there is a danger of losing what is interesting and useful to the general public when attempting to relay the history to them. In the aim of a more accurate history, much of the study has moved from the intentional, narrative sources to the unintentional, lists, receipts, and other documents being a good example, and from them to wring answers they never intended to give. In section 2, he turns his attention to the pursuit of fraud and error. Of all the issues that we have with our sources, those that are intentionally misleading are the most rage-inducing. Deceptive sources tend to come in two main types: deliberate fraud, that is, a text claiming to be something that they are not, and bias in selection. For example, Julius Caesar recording his own Gallic Wars. Caesar is clearly going to be a biased narrator. However, fraudulent documents are not entirely devoid of information. The very fact of the forgery can provide information as to the motives of the forgers. There is another form of forgery and deception. This is where false information is inserted into otherwise authentic sources. The origin of these errors can be from both malicious and also unintentional reasons. For example, if a newspaper journalist does not verify the information that they use in a story and publish what they believe to be correct, when in fact it is wrong. The creation of intentionally misleading documents is not limited to individuals, and the role of censorship and propaganda can create a whole section in the historical record that is inaccurate in a consistent way. It is also worth noting that well-meaning witnesses of events are going to be inaccurate to some degree. Much of this can be due to focus and attention. For example, a doctor who visits a patient will likely give a good account of the patient, while being a less reliable witness as to the furniture in the room. The idea of focus and attention also means that novel items and events tend to garner more focus and attention than common items and events, thus skewing the understanding that is transmitted through the historical record. Another factor in causing error and bias in the historical record is that many key events that are of interest were also times of chaos and change. They did not occur in a vacuum, and an accurate witness report from one vantage point does not convey the whole truth of the event. This is not to argue that nothing can be established from the historical record, but the exact causes and details are difficult to ascertain. In section 3, he moves on to look at logic in the critical method. Critical analysis of the historical record is a subtle art, but should be rational. And in some cases, the bias of the witness is clear for all to see, and its errors can stand out. Where two records contradict each other in terms of facts of an event, logic dictates that at most one of them can be true. And by merely taking a midpoint between the two records does not mean that you'll be any closer to the truth. And the historian would be better off spending their time working out which was the more accurate record. When it comes to assessing an artifact or a document, if credible, they are likely to be of a similar type to other similar sources of the time. However, at the other end of the spectrum, they should not be too similar. If two writers claiming to be eyewitnesses of an event record it in exactly the same way, using exactly the same words, it is almost certain that one of the authors is plagiarising the other, and was not an eyewitness at all, as they were claiming to be. And when an imitator or plagiarist is identified, it reduces the number of witnesses from 2 to 1. Whatever methods are being used to critically analyse a source, if they are pushed too far, may cause a contradiction or paradox. For example, with the general rule that for a source to be accepted as evidence, it should fit with similar sources. However, if you took this to an extreme, it would mean that no truly new discoveries could be made, and only current knowledge and understanding would be confirmed. When we evaluate the probability of an event having occurred, we are not following a strictly mathematical model of analysis, as the events either occurred or they didn't. Along with this, the historical record is replete with examples of unlikely events occurring. As difficult as it might be, critical analysis is important. Prior to the methods of critical analysis being developed, almost all things narrated were accepted as fact, and the role of the historian was merely to retell the stories of the past. But with critical analysis, a narrative closer to the objective truth can be uncovered. He finishes the chapter this way, quote, "Henceforth, far wider horizons open before it, and history may reckon among its most certain glories that by this elaboration of its technique, it has pioneered for mankind a new path to truth, and hence to justice." In chapter 4, he moves on to historical analysis, and begins by looking at judging or understanding. In the past, it had been the duty of the historian to describe things as they happened, and to let the facts as they stood speak for themselves. However, in any work of history, there is a difficulty in being truly impartial. There are two types of impartiality: that of the scholar in discovering of the facts, and that of the judge evaluating and passing judgment on the facts. The judgment of historical events is not objective, but subjective, as it relies on the values of the judge. When we treat the process of history as one of judgment, there is a tendency to construct the narrative to justify the judgment that we've already agreed upon. Along with this, much of the language that we use to describe historical people and events are subjective. For example, we use terms like success or failure of a general, but this presupposes a value judgment of the good that comes from a conflict. In this light, the state of understanding is one for the historian to seek, to understand as much as possible the causes and reasons, while minimising judgment on them. In section 2, he looks at a topic which he titles "From the Diversity of Human Functions to the Unity of Consciences." In seeking to understand history, the historian is not passive. Rather, the need to select from the sources is one that requires analysis and clarity. Often there is more information than can be used. If one were to attempt to convey all the available information, it would overwhelm the reader. Thus, the process of selection on the basis of understanding is vital. And once the information is selected, it needs to be organised rationally. The field of study will dictate both the selection and the organisation of the evidence. It is only after the sources have been selected, organised and analysed that they can then be reintegrated into the narrative whole of history. In this way, different focuses and attentions can give the reader and the historian a greater understanding of history in its entirety. And no individual work of history can give the whole of history, but it can shed light and understanding on the whole, when reintegrated with the works and output of others working alongside in related fields. The third section in this chapter is nomenclature. When defining an area or topic of study, the process of classification and categorisation is vital. In other fields of learning, especially the sciences, specialist language is both used and created that allow those studying it to understand what they are dealing with. And in the hard sciences, the language is selected by the scientist, and the subject matter has no say in it. Conversely, in history, because the historian is involved in and part of the matter being studied, the language of historical study is often muddled and ambiguous. When categorising history, a further difficulty arises. The use of language has changed over time, and the same terminology has different meanings depending on when and where it was used. This can happen in two ways. Either the word will stay the same and the thing being described will change, or the word will change and the thing being described will not. In particularly divided times, these changes in terminology or object can vary depending on location and not only time. Unlike the hard sciences, the study of history does not have a set of words and symbols separate from those in general usage. Because of these factors, the language and terminology used in documents can be evidence in and of themselves. In the end, the important thing is to understand the words and terminology as it was used at the time, and be mindful of the ones used by the historian when relaying their understanding to others. He finishes the chapter, and I quote, "To summarise, human time will never conform to the implacable uniformity or fixed divisions of clock time. Reality demands that its measurements be suited to the variability of its rhythm, and that its boundaries have wide marginal zones. It is only by this plasticity that history can hope to adapt its classification, as Bergson put it, to every contours of reality, which is properly the ultimate aim of any science." He finishes the book with a short chapter on historical causation. In history, as in other studies, the base of thinking is to ask why and to look for the because. In reality, for any event, there is an almost infinite number of influences that form part of the cause. However, not every influence is of equal interest to the historian. For one example, one would not fall over if there was no gravity. But this is not going to be of interest to the historian, as it is a constant, whereas the root sticking up out of the ground will be, as that doesn't always occur. There needs to be a balance between understanding that any event has a variety of causes, but that not all causes are of interest to the historian. The study of history seeks to uncover and understand multiple sequences of causal events that occur in order for the final event to occur. This way of thinking can lead to an idea that all of history has occurred through a logical sequence of events, that were the same circumstances to reoccur, the same event would be the outcome. However, this is rarely the case, as the influence of chaos and the foibles of the human mind will likely change the outcome. It is up to the historian then to dig beyond the basic causal influences and events, especially the emotional and psychological, and ask why, out of all possible outcomes, did this one come about? He finishes the book in this way, and I quote, "For, as soon as we admit that a mental or emotional reaction is not self-explanatory, we are forced, in turn, whenever such a reaction occurs, to make a real effort to discover the reasons for it. In a word, in history, as elsewhere, the causes cannot be assumed. They are to be looked for." And it is this looking that is the craft of the historian. Thanks for watching. If you did find this helpful, please like, comment, subscribe, do all those things, as it helps us out. See you next time.